Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Talk with CastleHill. I'm Tim Carbery, managing partner with CastleHill. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Sam and Joe, for a discussion about risk trends in 2021. Sam, why don't I hand it off to you as the host?
Thank you. As I'm hosting this week's episode, in honor of the new year and a very happy new year to our audience, we want to take a look at the upcoming risk trends for 2021. But before we get into that, Tim, you sent me an article about 2020 risk trends, which I thought was especially notable considering they published it prior to the pandemic shutdown, at least here in the States. I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about just an overview of those general risk trends from 2020, which ones kind of panned out, which one you kept an eye on, which one you predict will be notable in 2021 as well.
Sure. It's a really interesting. It's been a very interesting time, of course, for everyone. So, looking at this was a survey that risk.net did back in really it was January of 2020. And so it's really just as the pandemic or coronavirus was being identified and the threat of the pandemic was really starting to be understood, especially in Asia. And so at that point, most folks from a concerns perspective, it was really all around cybersecurity and data integrity and data security from those side of it. So the top two were IT disruption and data compromise. And IT disruption, and their definition is more about the risk of not having access to your IT assets, not having access through ransomware or other cyber attack type of activities that may be there. And then beyond that were the sort of the classic theft and fraud. Always a perennial top five kind of an operational risk. But then right behind that was third-party risk, which has risen back up again in significance. And I think the events of 2020 have actually escalated that rise once again. And then interestingly, in fifth place was resilience risk, right? And that really was focused again for 2020 on the concept of ransomware and people hijacking systems and things of that sort, and cybercrime, cybersecurity incidents from that perspective, as opposed to the simple fact that from pretty much all of 2020 through to today, we are operating in a business continuity mode. We are in a continuity exercise where most companies have had to basically be in a permanent state of their failover plan, given where we are. And there's obviously some differences because the core host, the IT disruption risk has not manifested itself, because people have been in this business continuity plan. And so it's been less about the things inside the firewall, more about that resilience and the ability to have your workforce who's now remote able to access those systems. So really all that resilience capability. Theft and fraud, of course, is still...
I was going to make a bad joke about risk going remote. So you can go ahead and continue.
Right. Yes, it definitely has. And so theft and fraud, of course, have continued to be a challenge, especially, again, with a lot of operational processes that may have relied on or identification processes that may have relied on people being able to be in person and go from there. I think that'll continue to be a challenge. But come back to the third party and resilience. And third party risk has been a very significant challenge for folks, not only because of the good and lovely SolarWinds incident that's been happening, but just because everyone is now working remotely or the majority of people are working remotely. Now, and having to rely on different vendors that may have been accelerated in their implementation, just relying on everything related to third and fourth parties for people who are now working in an uncontrolled environment or a less controlled environment than people may have wanted to. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this type of a survey changes from an industry perspective, and some of the articles that have already come out that we'll talk about here.
Yeah, definitely a very quickly changing world, and 2021 is promising to be just as odd, put it mildly, I'm sure. Still grappling with the day-to-day of COVID-19. There's just a lot of change happening, and a lot of change happening very quickly. And it will be interesting to see how the ball rolls. To get into 2021, the Operational Risk Data Exchange Association, or ORX, published its top risk review in October 2020, and it highlighted 5 main risks as we enter the new year. Those 5 risks are 1, information security, which includes cyber risk, 2, regulatory risk, 3, third-party risk, of course, 4, business continuity, like you were speaking to, and 5, technology risk. And I would just love to hear as we go forward, both of you speak a little bit on the industry impact that you see with these kinds of risks in mind, any current events. I know you just mentioned the SolarWinds hack, which I'd love to hear more about, Joe. And just generally your speculations for the future, what we can expect, what you are thinking as CastleHill tackles this new landscape. So let's start with the information security, which includes cyber risk. And Joe, I know you were looking at the SolarWinds hack. So if you want to speak a little bit to that and how it relates to information security.
Great, thank you. Well, the SolarWinds situation has brought cyber to the forefront in not only the United States, but around the world. You know, if we think back on 2020, there were a number of other major breaches that had the headlines, you know, like Microsoft or Twitter, or even some of the cruise lines. One of the things that's happening now that government agencies such as the FBI and the NSA and CISA, they're starting to supply organizations with a lot of information, a lot of data to help them not only protect themselves from potential bad parties, but also to recover from them as quickly as possible. So now the risk and cyber areas within organizations, they're kind of inundated because not only are they getting all of this new information from these government sources, but their organizations are changing. There's a lot of things going on. Technology's changing. And they are kind of going through their own renaissance and their own mini transformational or risk digital risk changes over here. And that's needed because Gartner is predicting that in 4 to 5 years that 75 to 80% of CEOs are going to be personally held responsible for breaches. So now you have these cyber risks and you have many other risks. Cyber is often discussed in different terms and in different ways than other risks. So, Tim, let me ask you a question. How do these CEOs who are now going to be personally responsible, how do they manage and how do they compare their cyber risks to other types of operational risks?
Yeah, it's something which is not done very well today in most cases. And I think, one of the interesting indicators, we'll call it, has been the response that we've seen to SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds is a little bit different than the usual hack because what happened, of course, is that they compromised the underlying software that's distributed across people's internal networks. And so as a tool that's monitoring and managing the actual underlying network, it gives you the keys to the kingdom. Right, so we haven't even heard about the hacks yet. We haven't even heard about the actual incidents like you're talking about that will end up getting a CEO in significant trouble, right? Whether financially or legally, right? So that's really going to be interesting because that's that type of wire level attack that the SolarWinds is something which people were getting a little bit more comfortable with from. You go back to the old, Target breach or things of that sort where people, got into the network through the air conditioning company. So that combination of bringing together the third party type of risk with your process-based risk this is an IT process that is fundamental to your IT management posture, your ability to effectively run your IT operations. And it turns out that the very popular software you're using has a backdoor in it that is allowing people access to your network or potentially allowing access to your network. And so those types of things are very, very difficult to guard against, which means that, again, just operational risk. It's people, process, technology, right? The people process part of this is going to have to continue to be evolved. And where in the past, the cybersecurity teams may have operated in their own bubble because of the consideration that the types of threats that they were dealing with could have a major impact if they were sort of mixed in with the regular old, bad processing type of checks or bad processing type of risks. Those risks are now really people process risks just as much as they are technology risks. And that's going to really mean that they need to bring that into the fold and get over that part of thinking that the cyber risk is something which has to be segregated because of the difference in how it actually operates.
So Tim, let me ask you, the way that people discuss cyber risk and the categories that they use is very different than some of the traditional operational risk categories. Is there any way that those can be brought together or made to work with each other?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, the ORX that we're quoting for the top 5 risks for 2021, right? They're just the most recent article that's out there in many cases, right? The ORX has been working to do that for the past few years and have actually made significant strides in that relative to the financial services industry. And, financial services helps to be a little bit of a bellwether for other organizations and other types of industries in many cases. But I think it's part of the ability to actually integrate those things together. So at CastleHill we have this whole concept of the business hub. Right? And our business hub is something which we use across any of the GRC tools and any of the operational risk management capabilities that we use. And the business hub is all about having those consistent taxonomies, whether it's simply describing your organization, right? Having that description there, because even to your point, even describing the organization is often different for those IT risk or cybersecurity risks than they are for your process or third-party risk. And there's no reason for that, right? It's actually detrimental to the organization being able to understand what the overall risk is. And the business hub is one of those tools that we use at CastleHill to ensure that people are thinking about it holistically, thinking about it from the business perspective, and getting away from believing that there's some special magic associated with these more technical or more specialized types of risk.
Thank you. To go down the list a little further, another point that they brought up was regulatory risk. Of course, regulatory scrutiny is a major area of concern, especially as many organizations struggle to deal with internal changes and just this very evolving landscape. But how is CastleHill approaching regulatory risk in 2021?
Well, if you think about the rate of regulatory change is not slowing down. If we look back at 2020, we had, like the SEC's best interest, and we also had different countries enabling different types of regulations to protect their citizens' data. And we have new things to look forward to in 2021. The United States and the UK are both looking into what type of regulatory oversight is needed for artificial intelligence and machine learning. And also the SEC is looking at, okay, how do we handle climate risk? How is that going to impact your organizations, and how do you need to respond to that? But if we think about regulations as they change, that's very tough. You have to know that the regulation changed, so you have to keep on the lookout for it. And okay, you get that, find it a change, but now, okay, my organization is different than when the regulation was enacted. So parts of my business were moved around. I have different departments, different organizations. I've got new products. I've got new businesses and new geographical areas. I mean, this is a manual nightmare. Tim, how do organizations that you've seen, how are they able to handle that?
Badly? Is that simple enough? So, we're long past the 3 interns in a cube, ability to manage for regulatory change, right? That is the old way. That is the way that a lot of companies, did it in the past. Unfortunately, there are still some companies that are out there that have that level of maturity, we'll call it, relative to their processes where they're bringing some folks together. And your talk about about regulatory change and the fact that it's not slowing down. There's a misperception of, I think, in a lot of cases for folks to believe that political events across the world actually have an impact on the speed of regulatory change. Right, regulatory change comes out of crises or a situation where people have had major breaches. So SolarWinds as an example, right? There will be some sort of intense regulatory activity that comes out of SolarWinds. But it'll take years for the actual implementing departments to actually talk to the organizations that have to deal with it and put those regulations in, right? And so now we have a fairly stable group of control taxonomies, right? We have many different organizations that put out well-established control taxonomies for cyber risk, for IT risk. All of those now are going to have to be reevaluated against the changes that are going to be happening in these regulations, right? And those changes in regulations, back to a point you brought up before, aren't just going to be about, what's your IT control. It's going to be about what your control is relative to the third party who's supplying that. What's your control relative to the the business team that is now working remotely, and how are they managing those things, right? Again, back to that business hub idea, you have to be able to understand your organization and what all those different tentacles are of the processes that are going to be impacted by these risks. You have to be able to find out and identify what those changes are, the regulatory changes, right? We have partnerships with Compliance AI, with Wolters Kluwer, with Cent Technology, right? So we actually have those provider content teams that are focused on actually doing that through advanced intelligence engines, through many different techniques, right? So you get it completely away from the three interns in the closet, right? Forget about all that, right? Get to a place where you're actually leveraging a service that's using technology to drive this information into your organization, and then actually get it into your GRC platform, into your compliance, your regulatory compliance risk management platform. Bring it into that, so in a way that actually looks at it holistically across your organization. So that when you have that change coming from the SolarWinds, attack, when GDPR gets revised relative to some particular incident that happened where a million people's information was exposed, you can actually look at that information from a GDPR perspective, see where that maps to your control libraries, to your control taxonomies that have been established, identify what business pieces are actually impacted by it, what IT organizations, what vendors, all of those different tentacles, like I said, which is really the key to operational risk and successful implementations through things like the Business Hub. So all of that automation has to be layered into it for people to really be able to do this effectively. And companies that are already into that automation, they're going to be much better positioned than firms that are still relying on, manual methods, or are still looking at regulations at a fairly high level, and not down to that point where they can really see how they're impacting the organization overall.
Yeah, but Tim, I've seen many organizations, and they each have their own different way of doing or handling different risks. One particular area does it one way, and another area does it another way. How would this be any different than that?
It's different because the source is external, right? The source of the risk, right? Compliance risk, or regulatory compliance risk, is based on the changes to regulations. And so the regulations are going to change equivalently for everyone. It's the impact that they have on the products you sell, the places you sell those products, the actual sales activities that you perform. That's where that uniqueness is, that has to be there. And I think that's where people misunderstand the fact that it's not about interpreting the regulation at the point of the regulation being created. It's about understanding the impact of the regulatory change in your organization and your capability, right? And that's pretty well standardized. Now you're just laying this against your overall environment, as opposed to it being just a single slice of operational risk.
Joe, when we were talking about making this video, you threw out a quote that I must confess I require more elucidation upon, which is about third-party risk and the FTC's recent announcement that they will pursue enforcement for the inadequate third-party risk management practices under the GLBA safeguards. That is a direct quote. Can you explain what that means for us who are a little less versed in, the risk world, and just sort of a general gist of how that relates to third-party risk in general?
Organizations have really increased their dependence on third parties. They're bringing in third parties to supplement them from a technology point of view, to bring in skills that they're lacking within the organization, and also to bring in extra arms and legs where needed. So the safeguard rule has to deal with safeguarding sensitive data. Okay, so now what this is telling us is that not only do you have to safeguard the sensitive data in your organization, you need to go out to your third parties and ensure that they are safeguarding your data as well. So that's extending your responsibilities. It's not just within your, little world there. It's now extending out to all of the third parties that you do business with. And if you like that, the OCC in a recent bulletin that they have that they came out with has indicated that, well, that's not enough. You have to now look at the third parties of your third parties. So essentially your fourth parties, people who you don't have a relationship with. You have to ensure and you have to have oversight that they are managing your sensitive data properly. And even better, the DOJ has said, well, you can't just look at a third party when you're bringing them on. In the beginning, you're starting to do business with them, and now you do an investigation, you see that everything is working correctly. You need to manage the risk for that third party over the entire life cycle that you are doing business with them. So you have to do it continuously, and you have to make sure that they are providing the services securely that you're asking and managing risks. And oh, by the way, they say that if you don't have proper resourcing, that's not an excuse. You have to ensure that your resources are properly staffed and that you're able to do this. And Tim, I don't know how companies can do this now. Their budgets are cut and their staffs are shrinking, and they have to now do all this work to look at third and fourth parties.
It's I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, so sorry, Joe and Sam, but one of the things I think that people forget about is the fact that especially now in the pandemic environment, and just talking about business continuity and resilience and things like that. So every day there are threats that companies don't understand relative to their third or fourth parties, right? So my favorite of the moment is that most folks have had some sort of a delivery from a major organization in the past, in the past several months, if not only deliveries from people. And if you notice, those companies are often taking a picture because of the risk of people's packages being stolen, right? So they're often taking a picture of the package showing in front of people's doors, or next to the garage, or wherever it is that they drop it off. And so as a business owner myself, right, we ship materials to our employees, we ship things to different people. Am I responsible for the picture that driver took, that contractor typically? Am I responsible for that picture that person took, which is sensitive data? It may have that person's address on it. It may be geolocated for that person. It's going through an unsecure email, most likely, to somebody to let me know that they did that. Now what's my level of risk relative to that capability? And as a business owner, I could be bogged down 100% of my time just worrying about or sorting through all of those different risks. And to your point about the DOJ saying you can't just say, well, I didn't have time to do it. In effect, I didn't have the resources to check through that risk. That's not acceptable. And so, organizations are just going to struggle further and further with this. It's going to be much tougher to get past some of these challenges. It's, GLBA is not new, right? Right. The requirement for the safeguards rule has been in place for a long time. People need to be able to have those plans there. And so when we look at this, when we're talking to folks overall, it's our TPRM capability, our GRC as a service, gold service for third-party risk management, is the kinds of solutions that are going to help people get past this, right? Where we have the capacity, the expertise, and the understanding to know what level of risk is engendered by having a photo of one of your employees' front doors, right? And what does that mean relative to your organization and how that is, and what is that relative to the risk of that versus poor poor underwriting practices, or having inadequate multiple assessments of people moving money or sending out bills to bankrupt third parties, right? Right? All of those things that have been happening recently in the news are very, very high level of risk, and you can't have your internal organization sucked up on all of those other things that need to be checked, but they need to be checked by people who can go through that very efficiently and drive those capabilities. So, I mean, organizations are just not ready for it. They're, in terms of they have legacy tools that they're using that were okay when they were doing, 20 or 30 assessments a year, right? They're going to be in an environment where they're going to need to do hundreds of assessments a year. And those assessments are going to be not only for third parties, they're going to need to do it for fourth parties. And how are you going to actually manage those capabilities is going to be a real challenge. And it's going to be one that the auditors and regulators are going to just be able to jump all over, because it's so simple for them to come in and do that audit against those processes and find something that's just not quite right, and be able to walk away saying, yep, we were able to find where there's some serious control gaps or some serious regulatory gaps overall on these capabilities.
Tim, shouldn't the needs that one company has be similar to another company? Shouldn't it just be much easier to do like that?
Yeah, I think the challenge or the belief has been in the industry that we can all get to a place where we can just all share data, right? Where we can have that, CastleHill went and got certified by some independent body for being the best third party and having the most secure things and doing all that sort of stuff. But that's actually a really big challenge overall to do that, because most companies have a level of uniqueness to their relationships with those third parties. We don't all have standardized contracts, right? We don't all have the exact same contract with every single third party or every single fourth party where we have no contractual obligations with them. And so I think it's been a little bit of a red herring for people to feel that they can go out and just get information and sort of have the blue seal of approval on a third party and be able to hand it off and say, well, we didn't need to do anything further than that. That being said, the process is identical, right? The process of performing this task is identical, regardless of whether it's obviously you're going to ask more questions, you're going to do further due diligence of a high risk vendor versus of a low risk vendor. But the process of actually asking the questions, evaluating the responses is identical and can be mass produced through our GRC as a service capability. And that's really the difference between thinking through this strategically versus thinking through it tactically, right? And trying to just have all those different activities, be treated, uniquely, and say, oh, we're going to do a different kind of assessment for this low risk person than we're going to do for a high risk one, or we're only going to do high risks with a SIG light, or we're going to do any of those sort of variations that are happening. You really need to have that consistency that comes through the experienced, lens of a GRC as a service client.
Now, Tim, if I might invite you to extend your stay on the soapbox just a little bit longer, as it seems to be a worthy one. You mentioned earlier about, in relation to business continuity, about organizations and companies, and feels kind of like the whole world is being embroiled in these contingency plans and being in a state of constantly deploying them, having deployed them. I was wondering if you could speak to that, especially in relation to 2021 and what that's looked like from a risk point of view. Yeah,
it's a really interesting. It's a whole interesting space by itself, because business continuity, a pandemic is an operational risk, right? Pandemic is one of the operational risks. It's often plugged into more of a geopolitical risk and things like that, as opposed to a business continuity risk. But what's been really interesting about the coronavirus pandemic has been that effectively we are in a continuous business continuity event. Now it's a half business continuity event, because typically most business continuity events assume that the home office or the source of the IT services, the source of the business services that are there, is someplace which is underwater or has had a significant natural disaster of some sort. In this case, most of those things are actually just fine, and it's simply the fact that people are rightfully staying at home, or are segregating or making sure that there's space and all of those things that we need to do in a pandemic situation. So it's really a strange situation where on one side of it, it's a very simple exercise, because the core systems that people are using haven't been failed over. The core systems are still there, but the fact that companies have to work in a remote environment where they can't actually co-locate people. So if your contingency plan said we're going to move everyone to Syracuse or Topeka or some other area, right, as a secondary location, you can't do that because people can't gather in those ways or may not be able to travel. And so it's from an operational risk perspective, I expect this to really, really be a deep focus of regulators, a deep focus of audit, and a deep focus of well-matured risk committees to look at how did we do in this business continuity environment that we've been in? What is our resilience? How well do we come across those plans? And all of the regulators, all of the oversight governance bodies have business resiliency or business continuity requirements that come from many years of different events, different disasters that have happened. And so how are those regulatory agencies going to come and look at those things? Are they going to consolidate that into a single set of regulations? Or are they going to bring that into a single set of perspectives or examinations? That'll really be an interesting piece of it. But more fundamentally, organizations are going to need to be able to look at how well they survived this, how well they offered those services to their employees, and what are they going to do in the future. And then as they make those decisions about what they're going to do in the future, they need to make sure that their risk management platform accounts for it, right? So you can't have that same pace of change where you're doing an annual review of your processes or your critical activities or your locations, your employment locations, and any of those things. That has to become as near real time as you can make it, as people have to react to the reality of where we are from a pandemic perspective. So even when people hopefully and happily are immunized and the COVID-19 variations have been quashed and we're in a situation where people can travel back into their offices, companies are going to have to think long and hard about how they're going to do that, whether they're going to do that, and what it means to the risk posture that they have, to their risk appetite that they have as a company. Doing that with a disjointed or poorly integrated risk management platform is going to be a real challenge for companies.
And this sounds like it's a very big job to get a lot of information internally from different areas throughout the company. Is that something that you're seeing is difficult for organizations to do, because they have to go out and essentially assess or keep track of what these different areas are doing and seeing that they are in good position for business continuity?
It's going to depend a little bit on the company. I would challenge and suggest that all of the information that's required is already there in the company. But if it's not well integrated, if they're not using a common set of taxonomies across the company to describe the company through their risk management platforms, that's really where they're going to have the challenge. And that's an exercise in risk management as opposed to an exercise in data collection, right? Because everybody has a business continuity plan. Everybody has done the identification of those critical activities. People know where those locations are. But if those three items don't match up with what you have in your cybersecurity or your third-party risk systems, if they're different, not organized into an integrated view of those things, you're now going to have to do all that translation, and that's where the work's going to be really hard, and that's where you're going to make mistakes, and those mistakes are going to show up in very unpleasant ways as we get past this.
I know we are approaching the end of our time for today's recording session, but does anyone have any sort of wrap-up thoughts? Joe, I know you talked a little bit about the issue with sort of piecemeal investing on the part of boards as risk management and becomes more complicated. Do you have any sort of points you want to bring up to that?
Well, if you think about where we are now, in 2020, the world changed. Now you have everyone in the organization is working remote. They don't have direct oversight anymore. They have remote oversight. And you have you've been building a corporate culture all along that was kind of centered on the workplace. Now you have to figure out what your corporate culture is. And within that, what is your risk management culture? How do you maintain that so people are doing the right thing, that without that direct oversight, that they're processing work in the best ways, and that the information is making it up to the board so that the board is able to make decisions as needed? So one of the big four accounting companies did a study, and they found that only 20% of board members are satisfied with the risk information that they receive. 20%. Now, if we look at organizations, they're often very siloed. Different organizations are doing different things and managing risk in different ways. We know that risks are very interconnected across companies, across organizations. So if they're processing things in a siloed mode, if they're looking at risks just within their silo, then things have a tendency to slip through the cracks. There was a study done by NC State, and they found that board members who were appropriately apprised of risk in different organizations, the organization paid less taxes. And not only that, they were less subject to regulatory scrutiny. So there's a lot to be said for providing that information, providing the correct information to the board so that they can assess what the risk is across the organization. But from a lot of things that I've seen, with very siloed organizations where they're, each part is doing their own thing, that's a big problem. And Tim, I know that you have managed some of the largest GRC and IRM implementations in the world. How do you handle something like that?
Yeah, don't remind me. Yeah, I'm only 22. This gray hair is just from something else.
I'll take it no matter what color it is.
There you go. The real challenge, as you rightly pointed out, and these, I love the quote about the tax rate being lower for a company that has a good integrated view of those things. It actually humorously comes back to this fundamental concept that if you can't actually describe your company, then you can't describe your company's risk, right? Fundamentally, right? It's just as simple as that. And so not having good or the need to have very, very strong reference data about your company, have that implemented in a way that makes sense, which is effectively our business hub concept. That really is the starting point for this. And that doesn't mean that you have to have all that information in a single system, right? We're way past that time, from a technology perspective. The ability to actually have it federated through technology in a way that makes the integration of that data, the integration of that information seamless. It's in everyone's grasp, right? It's not something which is some magical or mystical capability that's out there. People sometimes misconstrue during these types of very large integrations that we have to get to that perfect set of data. Once we have that perfect set of data, we're going to be fine. Well, the reality, of course, is that every company is changing every single day, and that's been the slam in the face of 2020 overall, right? Every single day, there's some new aspect to the organization that's a change. Oh, we're going to be able to bring people back into the office in a couple of weeks. Let's start planning for that. Nope, can't do that. There's been a spike. People are going to move into different areas because they're concerned about being in a more populous area. They want to be down in some area where it's warm, where they can get outside and potentially, do things like that, right? All of those changes have been happening every single day. The reality is that those changes are part of business. They are part of what you just have to deal with. And so it's a little bit of again, of that red herring aspect to say that, we do things on an annual basis. We do things on a regular cadence. You need to do things on a perpetual cadence, right? It has to be activities that are happening all the time. And so when you think about integrating your GRC environment, you start thinking about integrating your risk management environment and all of the information that's available to a company for the purposes of risk management, you have to think about it in that continuous change mode. and use the tools and technologies that are out there, which are, again, well-established patterns. We're not creating new patterns to do this stuff. This is very straightforward types of information. We've been doing it in the capital markets world forever, right? It feels like from that perspective. Just you have to think about it more in that progressive progressive technology viewpoint, as opposed to thinking of it in that we're very static and set of information that's not going to be there. So we've done some of those very, very large integrations. We've done them where we brought all those systems together into a single primary system that is really the feeder to other things. We've done it in situations where we've had to have a fully federated view of those types of capabilities. We've done it for MetricStream and Open Pages and Archer and Process Unity and all these different tools overall. So all the different partners that we have. All of them have their strengths and weaknesses, but at the end of the day, it's not about that. It's not about one of those being the king of the hill. It's really about making sure that the information that's being used across them is synchronized and is effective for the fundamental purpose, which is to be able to tell somebody how much risk am I taking on by doing this activity. Right? That's
a stronger
ultimately
fortress overall.
Yep. Or as I like to joke, how much money do I need to keep in the mattress? Right. That's ultimately the only answer that we're all looking for, is just how much reserve do I need to keep in my pocket to take this risk and to move this forward. So that's really the fundamental piece of those, whether it's a very small, company that just needs to have some basic risk capabilities in place, or the world's largest financial services institutions. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, you got to think about it from that perspective. Business is always changing. Your organization is always changing. Your structure is always changing. How are you going to be able to bring all that information together in a way that's effective, so that you're not constantly in a change management organizational structure? You're in a risk management organizational structure. That's somewhere CastleHill has got the best experience of anybody.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time to talk to me about these trends. There's a lot of information to ruminate over as 2021 unfolds before us. A very happy and safe New Year to our listeners at home, and we'll see you next week on Coffee Chats with CastleHill.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye now.